My name is Olga Sidorishkina. I'm the program curator of Ukrainian Institute London, and probably you all know that Ukrainian Institute London is an independent charity that champions Ukrainian culture and shape the conversation about Ukraine in UK. So, in November, Ukraine marks the Day of Memory for victims of the Holodomor, the man-made famine of the 1930s and one of the biggest tragedies in Ukrainian history. However, despite being well known in Ukraine, this chapter of history continues to be poorly understood beyond its borders. Tonight we will have a conversation about how cinema, art and literature can raise the awareness about the Holodomor and explore its significance in the context of ongoing war. I have an honor to introduce you our speakers. So on the left is Andrea Chalupa. She's a writer and a producer of Mr. Jones, and a film directed by Agnieszka Holland. Agnieszka Holland, and Mr. Jones is probably one of the most well-known films dedicated to Holodomor, and if you haven't seen it, please check on it. I highly recommend it to you. Also, Andrea is a writer of In the Shadow of Stalin, the story of Mr. Jones, the book you can buy after this conversation, and also I believe Andrea can sign it to you. On the right, I have Daria Mattingly, and she's a historian and a senior lecturer in the University of Chichester. Daria is also featured in one of our short films from the series 10 Things You Need to Know About Ukraine. She's talking about the Holodomor in this short film, and if you're interested in it, check on our YouTube channel where we have all these videos and also where we put all our pre-recorded conversation from the different events. And one more important thing before I pass the floor, after this conversation we are going to have a drink reception in the library, so I kindly ask you to stay and continue our conversation in informal atmosphere. Thank you so much, thank you for being here.
Thank you all for coming, and I suggest we start with a minute of silence in honor of all the victims of the Holodomor that takes place in Ukraine the third Saturday of November. So it is not Saturday, but it's still November, and in memory of them. Let's keep silent for a minute. It is a great pleasure and honor to have Andrea with us today, because when I teach Soviet history of Ukraine, and the Holodomor looms large in Soviet history, most of my students, if they do know anything about the Holodomor, know thanks to Andrea's film. And so my first question would be about the film, not the book yet. How did you come up with this idea? Why did you decide to write a script for the film about the Holodomor?
Well, the project of Mr. Jones was inspired by my did Lonya, my grandfather from Donbass, Ukraine. He was born in Donbass. He grew up thinking in Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian, writing Ukrainian. And of course, I'm supposed to go like this. Hello. And of course, Donbass changed drastically after the famine, and the whole region became repopulated with Russians. And shortly before he passed away, he wrote down his entire life story on a Ukrainian typewriter, and he left it for me, specifically me, because he was my world growing up. I used to sing songs from The Little Mermaid at the top of my lungs, and he thought I had the most amazing voice. And he was my life, he was my everything. And that was my first big loss in life as a little girl. I think he died when I was 11. And I just never got over that grief. And I remember in sixth grade standing before my class and telling my class that there was a man-made famine. Stalin deliberately mass murdered millions of people. The vast majority that died were Ukrainians. And the New York Times deliberately covered it up. And the money the agriculture that was taken out of Ukraine was then sold abroad to help Stalin rapidly modernize his empire. I said that in sixth grade, that was the plot of Mr. Jones. And then when I got to university, I remember my father pointed out, do you see that girl that was bagging our groceries? She was an English major, has no idea what she wants to do with her life. So I understood that if I become an English major, I'll have no idea what to do with my life. But I knew I wanted to be a writer. I was always expressing myself as a child. I grew up reading Percy and Percy Shelley and Lord Byron and writing plays, producing these dramatic plays with love affairs when I was a little girl. So I just had this dramatic flair as a child, that was the way I engaged with the world and understood with the world. My mother took me to see Schindler's List as a child, which is a wonderful thing to do. I'm a big fan of taking your children to watch difficult cinema, because that's what I was raised on. And now here we are. And so my mother took me to see Schindler's List, and I felt such an immense power watching that film. I had a sense that I was participating in an act of justice by bearing witness to history. I couldn't go back in time and change what happened, but I can learn. And just that act of learning felt like resistance. And that's very important today as we have fascism rising around the world and anti-Semitism rising around the world, including Holocaust denial. And so I felt very strongly that I wanted to make a movie like Schindler's List, like that sort of caliber of cinema, to honor my grandfather and the countless nameless that suffered under Stalin. And I had no idea how to do it, no idea. And in college, I studied Soviet history. In fact, I studied intellectual history, the history of whatever, I don't know, you're the academic, but I studied, I had a wonderful, passionate, very nerdy Tolkien teacher, Michael Saylor, who I really should email and be like, you have no idea how much you've changed my life. But I learned all about intellectual history through him. And in fact, there's an exam I took of his. I still have the blue book, exam book, where it's the entire plot of Mr. Jones all spelled out in this history exam. It was I got an A on the exam. And it's pretty incredible to think that my history degree launched my career as a filmmaker. And I told my friends, I remember I was supposed to write a very impressive and heavy Soviet honors thesis on the role of religion in Ukraine's attainment of independence. My chairman was this Gandalf the Grey, chairman of the history department, very serious, very intimidating, and I was going to be a very serious person. And I was like, oh, this is so boring. What did I sign up for? And to procrastinate, I was like, well, what was the deal with Walter Duranty? Why did he do what he did? It's like journalists are supposed to fight for the truth. That is not a journalist to deliberately cover up a famine. And so I procrastinated by going down the Walter Duranty rabbit hole. And I learned that he and Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist, shared a lover. Walter Duranty would write these Latin hymns for these black magic orgies in 1920s Paris. They would ritualistically sodomize people in these black magic orgies, and I was like, this is incredible. And as a college kid, I'm like, this should be a movie. This guy is such a supervillain. And the more I found out about him, I'm like, oh my God. It was like sex, drugs, and rock and roll back then. And I was like, oh, this explains a lot. He was just like a straight up hedonist. He believed in nothing, just a nihilist. And Big Lebowski was a popular movie at the time, and in Big Lebowski, there's those German nihilists who believe in nothing Lebowski. And I was like, this is the energy I'm going to bring to this project. So that was my gateway into, and initially, the person that Ukrainians were in the diaspora were celebrating, that we were very into as a community, was Malcolm Muggeridge, who of course was a famous British journalist. He was even mentioned in the Netflix series, The Crown. His name comes up. And a wonderful institute in Toronto, the Holodomor Research and Education Consortium, had done interviews with him. So he was our guy. He was the anti-Duranty. He was a hero that wrote for the Manchester Guardian, and he was trying to get the truth out about the famine. So initially, it was going to be Malcolm Muggeridge versus Walter Duranty, and that was my story, and I was set. And then I went to Ukraine after college. I had saved up a bunch of money working through school. My parents were trying to convince me not to go. My sister was like, go to Australia, go have fun surfing, because they were so scared of me going, traveling that country alone. And I had saved up my money at Independence. I was like, I'm off to go find myself, find my film. And I brought with me for spiritual protection my grandfather's memoir, typed in Ukrainian. And I found a translator there, and I got the pages back, and that was just so incredibly meaningful. to hear his words again, hear his story. And it was while researching the script in Ukraine that I came across a website that was just put up by Gareth Jones's niece Cyril and her son Nigel Coley. And so just like my grandfather was the world to me growing up, Gareth Jones was the world to Cyril Coley growing up. And so Cyril and her son Nigel, more than anyone, anyone on this planet, moved heaven and earth to keep his legacy alive through this great website. And so I reached out to them, and Cyril got back to me right away, and I flew to London. We had a wonderful afternoon together, and I was, and then I just began like reading and interviewing and digging through everything that I could. I interviewed famine survivors. I did several different drafts of the script. I even had George Orwell and his wife Eileen going in and out of the story, sort of like the Virginia Woolf film with Nicole Kidman, The Hours. If you've seen the movie The Hangover, about all those boys that get really drunk on I had like a hangover version with all these like horrible journalists getting drunk in Moscow. I had so many different versions over the years that I wrote. And it wasn't until a group of Russian friends that were working with Razum for Ukraine, a wonderful Ukrainian organization, to organize a march in New York City in 2015 in solidarity with Boris Nemtsov's march in Russia. It was an anti-war march. We were going to do it in New York City. We're all excited. The Russians and Ukrainians were getting together. And then I'm working on my screenplay. I'm following Gareth Jones around the shadow of the Kremlin. I take a break from writing and I check Twitter and I see the news. Boris Nemtsov assassinated in the shadow of the Kremlin. So our anti-war march, our Nemtsov march in New York City with the Russians, turned into a wake. And my Russian friends just looked haunted with shock. And it just felt like there's no way out of this. We're stuck. But the Ukrainians were chanting and making things very lively as Ukrainians do. And I was just so furious by what they did to Nemtsov that I threw out much of my script and I began like a page 1 rewrite. And it was the angriest thing I ever wrote. And it was this draft of the film where I just grabbed the reader by the throat and said, how dare you not care about what's going on today? And I sent that angry version of the script to Agnieszka Holland. I had her email thanks to Tim Snyder, a mutual friend, who was one of the many historians on the project. And people around Agnieszka said, don't give your hopes up. She just said no to the greatest script ever written with big names attached. Agnieszka read the screenplay and she said yes right away. And the reason why is because for her, the story was also deeply personal. Agnieszka grew up in Soviet-occupied Poland. Her mother and father were journalists. Her father's official cause of death was suicide while under police interrogation. He jumped out the window. And she learned about it in the newspaper, and she went, as a little girl, and she went mute for several months after that happened. And so Agnieszka brought her own lived experiences of growing up under Soviet occupation, and she was also in Prague as a young film student when the Soviets invaded. And she spent several months in prison where she experienced real sadism and torment. And so the reason why the film feels so authentic, like for instance, my parents went to the Soviet Union in the 70s on an academic trip. And my dad said, the KGB minder that Gareth Jones meets is totally the guy that we had when we were there. And so, so Agnieszka, as we're making the film, she'd be like, we're gonna put this old lady at the end of the hallway in the hotel to watch Gareth, because that's what they had. And so it was really to her credit, like she brought it all in, and all the actors, the actors came in all extremely well read. Obviously, it's a historical thriller. It's not a Wikipedia page. The whole point of the film is to go find credible works like Anne Applebaum's Red Famine, Tim Snyder's Bloodlands, Europe between Hitler and Stalin, which opens with the story of Gareth Jones. The whole point is to be like, come learn more about this from credible researchers and not charlatans.
And tell us a little bit more, because you told a family story, how you came to this, to making this film. Your family connection to George Orwell.
Yes, this was a discovery. So Gareth Jones's story is quite tragic because Walter Duranty lives to a ripe old age, enjoys celebrity, and Gareth, his life is snuffed out the day before he turns 30. And amazingly, years later, on a day I was giving a presentation to a group of journalists about the history of Gareth Jones, my niece was born on the day Gareth was murdered. That's her birthday, and so I call her the Gareth Jones baby. and so, but side note, but so yes, the George Orwell connection. So Gareth Jones's story is tragic, and Americans don't like tragic. And so I was trying to find a way to make the story bigger and relatable to a Western audience. And I was reading in Christopher Hitchens' introduction to Animal Farm that Orwell had struggled for years to get Animal Farm published. And finally, a independent press put out some copies. And one ended up in the hands of Ukrainian refugees who immediately understood the profound significance of what Orwell was trying to say. They saw themselves in Animal Farm. And they worked with him by letter to produce copies and give them out in the refugee camps. And I thought, well, what a beautiful, happy ending. Gareth is killed, but his work lives on in Orwell's Animal Farm. And the truth comes out through Stalin's own victims, finding their power through art. And so I put that in the script, and I saw my Uncle Vitaly for Christmas Eve dinner, and I caught him up on my film project, told him everything I just told you, and he looks at me and goes, oh yeah, I have a copy of that Animal Farm. I picked it up in the refugee camp as a kid. And my Aunt Tanya, who's a librarian at Barnard University, she jumps up from the table, rushes to his bedroom, and comes back with this tattered old book I'd seen a million times in my research and gave it to me. And now I have it in my own personal collection. And the young Ukrainian hipster kid that wrote to Orwell, that created that refugee camp edition of Animal Farm, he went on to found the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, where I studied right before he died, right before going to Ukraine. I met him. And he himself went on to live this life of being like an Indiana Jones academic, traveling the world looking for like rare manuscripts. And he himself had like an obituary in the New York Times because he was so significant for making Kiev Rus, putting it on the map academically to show that that was actually a very significant Byzantium kingdom at the time that had great influence in the world. So all these people aren't just footnotes. These are giants that were involved in this larger story of humanizing Ukraine, of decolonizing the world's understanding of Ukraine and its significance in world history.
Yeah. And what about the actors in the movie, Vanessa Kirby and James Norton? Did they know anything about the Holodomor before?
Nothing, and they were completely shocked by that, and that was a big motivator for why they signed on to the project. All of them came to set like graduate students, like very well read, widely read. When they came on set, when they were all cast, we sent them an extremely long list of articles, all sorts of news articles, news clippings, all sorts of books, primary sources of the day. The very first thing Vanessa Kirby said to me, she took me by the hand and said, I read everything you gave me. I read everything you gave me. And she herself was creating her character because of really trying to ground herself emotionally, spiritually in that moment in time. This is 1933, a year that lives in infamy, just like 2020. So 1933, Hitler comes to power. One of the first things he does is start building his first concentration camp. Stalin gets away with mass murdering millions. And FDR, officially recognizes the Soviets, opening up Russia for big business and sweeping this famine under the rug, as we see in the film. It was one of those years. And so Vanessa was coming at the story with this biography that she came up with, that she was, which I think is just such an important thing for us to remember, which is, especially Americans, is that 1933 Germany, the Weimar Republic, was a time of great freedom and creative energy and progressive idealism. The left was doing extremely well in Germany and Austria at the time. Unions were surging. The arts were so incredibly innovative. Berlin at the time was a capital of LGBTQ rights. It was a paradise on earth. If you could go back and have like a lost weekend in Berlin during that time, you would do it because it was that kind of place. And people forget, they look back and they see history as black and white, and they have this sort of like childlike, infantile understanding of things, but the reality is Berlin of 1933 was like New York City 2024. It was an exciting place of freedom and self-expression, and you can be anybody you wanted to be. And it was an intellectual hotbed. And so Vanessa said, that's the world I came from. I'm on the side of that, like the liberal arts, the freedom of expression. And as part of that, though, she was caught up with the communists. And so that was sort of her cause that blinded her when she got to Moscow, thinking it'd be something else. And so she really played a role in shaping Ada Brooks. And James Norton as well, like he brought his own, obviously it's a fictionalized Gareth. The real life Gareth Jones is far more interesting. And I refer everyone to Anne Applebaum and Tim Snyder to read about that. And Peter Sarsgaard, my God, he plays Walter Duranty. Walter Duranty was extremely difficult to write because he was a real life villain. The more I learned about him, the more I was like, this guy is evil incarnate. He, for instance, got his maid pregnant. They had a child, and he abandoned both back in Russia and went on with his life somewhere else. Moscow was such a hotbed of the avant-garde that he's recorded as going to a party where a Russian boy and girl were boarded up inside the wall, and people thought it was hilarious. It was just sadism. It was sort of like in New York City, we have this fashionable fascist podcast called Red Scare, which tries to glamorize fascism. It's these two socialites that go around to all these cool parties and nightclubs and make fascism seem fashionable. I don't know how else to put it. So Duranty was very much of that sort of Red Scare type. And Peter came in, and he had to find a way to humanize Duranty. And I was like, good luck. And he came in defending him. Like, he just wanted to be an artist. Like, he didn't want to, the journalism was a day job. For him, he wanted to be a great artist. And that was sort of Peter's way in, playing this making like Duranty this watery sort of hedonist. And I thought he did a masterful job at that. So the actors were destined to do the roles. It was a coalition of soulmates on set. All the minor roles that came in and out of set, the entire shoot, were like massive actors in their own countries. And it was just a beautiful, creative, very free set of democratization of ideas. Like the best ideas won. Nobody was, people, it was just very, really wonderful. And I am a huge believer in telepathy after making this movie, because Agnieszka, before she would speak, I would know exactly what was coming out of her mouth. It was like our thoughts were just going straight into each other's minds, and so telepathy is real. If you take anything from tonight, it's telepathy is real.
And you've made your film some years ago, but I'm sure you've done so much research, you couldn't escape drawing parallels between the Holodomor and the current war, Russo-Ukrainian war. And what are the key parallels you can draw, what you showed in the movie, this attempt to subdue Ukraine, to extract everything out in the movie, and today, between the war and the Holodomor?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that the film came out when it did, I think it absolutely helped Western audiences understand this is a genocide. This is what, Tim Snyder and other experts in genocide have said this is a genocide. And the cult of Stalin has been going up for years across Russia. In fact, Memorial, the largest, most respected human rights organization in Russia, founded by a Soviet dissident, they had been under extreme pressure by the Kremlin for years. Historians arrested for uncovering a mass grave of Stalin's victims. One historian was arrested and accused of pedophilia against his own daughter. His life destroyed, his daughter's life destroyed. And so Memorial existed to give a name back to the nameless, to restore human dignity, to heal through history, which is so important, because a nation that knows its history protects its future. And Memorial dared to show Mr. Jones in Moscow a group of Putinites, masked men, young men, crashed the event, started chanting, screaming all these anti-Ukrainian slogans. The police were called. I don't know who called the police, but the police came and they locked the doors. They kept everyone inside the screening. No one was allowed to leave. They confiscated the cameras, the laptops, everything of the organization. And then shortly after, a judge liquidated Memorial. It was shut down. It no longer exists. And the last act of bravery they carried out was daring to show Mr. Jones. And yes, of course the history is repeating, because we used one monster, Hitler, to get rid of, we used one monster, Stalin, to get rid of the other monster, Hitler. And as George Patton, General Patton, and so many others, and Orwell himself predicted, we were still left with this unfinished business of World War II. People have to keep in mind this fact, which is illegal if you say this in Russia, because they passed a law against this. World War II started with Stalin. It was Stalin and Hitler that invaded Poland. The Germans went first, and then the Soviets went 2 weeks later, and they had joint Soviet and Nazi military parades together in Poland. That is what got World War II started. And in fact, Hitler did not start mass murdering on the same level of Stalin until they invaded Poland together. So Stalin gave Hitler cover to be like, we're gonna carve up Europe together. I have your back, let's do this. And that's when Hitler really unleashed all hell, because he felt the protection of the Soviets. And of course, being madmen, eventually Hitler turns on Stalin, right? But people don't understand like the real granular history of World War II. And now, of course, Russia has turned the victory of World War II, their part in it, into like a religion. And you can't mention the truth of it. Well, actually, you guys started it. So yes, of course, it's like we've never dealt with that. And so Russia, without Ukraine, they're searching for their lost identity of empire, and they don't really make much as a country. And so the ruling oligarchs, they steal from the people. Now they're stealing from Ukraine, and if we don't stop them in Ukraine, they'll steal from Poland, they'll steal from the Baltics, and they'll keep going, because it's a culture built off of piracy, sort of like pirating like all the countries that they occupy.
Going back to the topic of our conversation about how to talk to the foreign audiences about the Holodomor, why have you chosen graphic novel as a format to talk to Western audience?
Well, it took me 14 years to research, write, and produce Mr. Jones, and with my projects, failure is not an option. Like, this is going to get made somehow. And I read that Kevin Costner struggled to get Dances with Wolves made, and that they made a book at one point about it. And I thought, you know what, I'll make a book as a backup, so at least the story will get out there through the book. And a group of historians that were supporting me during this time, they funded to produce this. This was not the publisher. Like, the Ukrainians had to raise money. Like, we had to raise the money among ourselves through all these different institutes to hire an illustrator. And I didn't make a dime off of this. Like, this has just been like, this story needs to get out. And so I just had to have the story out there, because I thought the film might be a long shot. And ironically, the film was actually easier than the book. Because of the pandemic, there was a paper shortage, and the publisher was going through all sorts of changes, and we finally fought to get it out. And I want to just tell everyone here, the copies that, we have a bunch of copies here. How do I say, they're not being, so the price of the book is a donation to Razum for Ukraine, which does emergency humanitarian work for Ukraine. And they do amazing, amazing work, and they're extremely trusted in the States. And I've known them since they started with EuroMaidan as an emergency group, and they're brilliant. They're so effective and good. And so the price of the book is a donation to them. So now because of the war, the timing of this book is perfect, because now we're using it to fundraise for Razum. So your help, so that's what we need. We need you guys to give money to Razum and get a book as a thank you.
Yeah, and if there is, obviously you studied history of Ukraine, and you've got personal connection. And by the way, your grandfather featured in Anna Applebaum's book.
Yes.
And commission for Ukraine,
yes.
U.S. Commission on Ukraine in the 1980s. He gave us testimony, and then you
Yes.
found out about that.
Yes.
You studied, is there any other historical event in history of Ukraine, Soviet or not, that you would, if you had unlimited budget to produce a film or graphic novel, you would consider highlighting?
Yes, actually my next project. So my father-in-law is on Wikipedia for leading a student uprising in Bucharest, Romania in 1956 in solidarity with the Hungarian uprising next door. He was a medical student listening to pirate radio, and he heard these Hungarian college students take over the radio towers and saying, like, wherever you are, if you hear this, Rome is fallen, rise up, this is our time. So in 1956, it felt like what the Arab Spring would feel like, right? The Hungarian freedom fighter was on the cover of Time magazine. So my father-in-law, as a young medical student, took this very seriously. He broke up with his girlfriend for her own protection. He organized these clandestine meetings in the library. And the night before they're about to march on campus, he was lying in his dorm room, listening to Puccini's Tosca. This was 1956, so there's no rock and roll then. So what was the pop music? It was Tosca. And so Puccini's Tosca is, of course, about a fiery woman who gives her life for a freedom fighter. So his mind is filling with these romantic images, like he is that freedom fighter. And he gets a knock on the door, and it's 12 Securitate agents who march him out across campus to make an example of him, and they throw him in prison. The prison soon fills with other college students and intellectuals, and they continue their studies inside the prison. So he learned astronomy from the astronomy students. He learned French. He learned public speaking, and he continued his medical studies as the prison doctor. So he would treat the torture wounds. And he finally went on a hunger strike to protest the brutality, and the guards force-fed him. They threw him in solitary confinement, and the prisoners had a riot demanding that their doctor be released. And that was the first time in his life he heard La Marseillaise, the French national anthem, which is like a protest anthem. And the guards finally released him and got him a lawyer, which was a symbolic victory, but did absolutely nothing. And he ultimately spends 6 years in this communist prison. And his mother, who had escaped the regime and fled to Paris, moved heaven and earth to free her son. And so she really does embody the real-life Tosca. So I show their story of mother and son connected through the Iron Curtain, through the power of music. And so you see like the heroine Tosca coming alive through this delicate magical realism. And so for me, the goal is to create a Soviet Shawshank Redemption. And yeah, so if I had unlimited money, all I would do is write Soviet history scripts. And so if you have unlimited money and you love, we could do a lot of great work together, because history is healing. History is healing, and we need the arts to have these conversations and to help with that healing.
And who is the target audience for your comic novels?
Middle school, high school, anybody, obviously people of all ages love comics. And for me, it was a way to get the book into schools and to give it out to members of Congress. The Ukrainian embassy is giving out a copy to the new incoming Congress. I don't know how many of them actually read, but the goal is yeah. And so the goal is to just, the reality is for all colonized people who have been denied any agency, denied a voice for so long and erased. And right now, that's what the Russians are trying to do. They're trying to erase Ukrainians. They're committing genocide by the legal definition of the term. Right? Like Putin himself has said they've kidnapped 700,000 children, and they're forcing them to forget their parents, forget their language. It's genocide. And so so a lesson to all colonized people. The reality is, and on all marginalized groups, the reality is you have to organize as a community to tell your own stories. This book came out from me begging people for donations. It wasn't hard because Ukrainians really are generous people, but you know what I mean? But this was like a community project. It was like the community getting together, putting in money, hiring an artist, and now this you are my family. You welcomed me here, and now you all came together because this is what we do. Communities support each other. That's our survival. That's how we get our stories out there in the world against the huge machinery that we're up against. No, we're not Elon Musk. We're not trillionaires, but we have each other, and that is incredibly powerful, and that is how Ukraine has survived this long, generation after generation, through communities like ours.
Yeah. And my final question is rather provocative, but...
Let's do it.
Yes. Why does the West why does it have to care about the Holodomor, which happened a long time ago in Ukraine, which was part of the Soviet Union? So it's all that fuzzy Soviet Union. Why should the West care? And Olesya Khromenchuk writes about Ukraine fatigue, when Ukraine featured so large in the news that some people have too much and it goes to the back. story and so on. So how do you justify to your audiences that you should want to know about the Holodomor? Why does it matter?
It's a shocking story. I think anybody that bothered to pay attention to it would be like, why wasn't I taught this in school? And the reason why you weren't taught it in school, as Mr. Jones shows, the West were accomplices. It's a story of Western corruption. It's a story of corruption in the media. It's a story of Fox News. It's a story of a lot of useful idiots in the media. And it's not just Fox News. It's the New York Times normalizing Trump's fascism. It's Jeff Bezos refusing to let his newspaper endorse anyone this election. And on it goes. It's the sin of access journalism. And it's a story of media literacy. And the reason why I was able to launch a podcast, Gaslit Nation, that went instantly viral. It went instantly viral because I had this X-ray vision from studying history. I saw all the Walter Durantys, not just Tucker Carlson's, but I saw the so-called good guys at the New York Times who were talking out of both sides of their mouths and planting hit pieces for Trump and the MAGA movement. And I was able to call them out, and people were like, "How do you know this?" I'm like, "Because I've studied the original version of these guys, and they're coming back around again." And so that's what it is. If you want X-ray vision to see where things are going, to see who you can actually trust, you have to study history. You have to study you have to learn about this as an important, urgent lesson for today of how Western corruption aids Russia's genocidal war.
So there are plenty of Durantys, what you're telling us.
Oh yes, unfortunately.
What about Gareth Joneses?
That's, well, I'm actually seeing one tomorrow. Her name's Carol Cadwallader. She writes for The Guardian. She's a dear friend and a hero of journalism, and I want to do a film on her. She's also from Wales, and I think she's somebody who's an Orwell of our day and incredibly brave, and has been targeted so severely for speaking the truth. So Carol, absolutely, Carol Cadwallader, and then ProPublica. I'm very lucky to have worked with Jesse Eisinger, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at ProPublica, which is a nonprofit newsroom. If you're looking to donate for media, that's a great one. Jesse led the investigations into our extremely corrupt Supreme Court. He got that going. And so yeah, we do have a lot of good people. If you're not getting hit pieces, if you're not getting your reputation slandered, if you're not getting, if you're not getting death threats, if you don't feel any sense of danger, like your life's on the line, like you have to take certain conservative precautions, then you're not actually practicing journalism.
That's not to put off a younger generation joining the profession.
I have such a collection of hit pieces. I wear them like a badge of honor. And because the thing is, anybody who would dare to throw dirt on you is dirty themselves. And that's why it's up to us to speak the truth.
Okay.
Never forget that. There's a lot of cowards out there. There's a lot of cynical people, a lot of people trying to cash in for their 15 minutes of fame. And they will sell you out if it gets them a little bit of attention. And those are the people who karma will take care of, and it's your job to stand in your truth and hold your own and call them out like a thing of beauty, because that's what you were put on this earth to do.
Thank you, Andrea. And before we open the floor to discussion, let us thank you with applause.